Every major cathedral in Europe claims to hold the bones of an apostle. Rome, Constantinople, Santiago, Cologne, the bones of the 12 men who walked with Christ, scattered across a continent, venerated for nearly 2,000 years. Pilgrims traveled thousands of miles to pray beside these remains. Wars were fought to possess them. Kingdoms negotiated for a single finger bone. But when scientists finally tested them, most of those bones told a very different story. They didn't belong to apostles. They belonged to strangers. For centuries, the story was simple. Christ chose 12 apostles. They spread his teachings across the known world. They were martyred in distant lands. Every cathedral, every abbey, every chapel claimed a fragment of the sacred past, and then their followers gathered what was left of them. Bones were wrapped in silk, sealed in golden cases, placed inside the most important churches ever built. That was the story for 2,000 years. Nobody questioned whether the bones were genuine, because questioning them was unthinkable. Church law required a relic to consecrate every altar. No relic meant no church. The shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne drew more medieval pilgrims than any site in northern Europe. Santiago de Compostela built an empire around the bones of St. James. The entire architecture of medieval Christianity was built on the physical reality of these relics. Then the laboratories got involved, and the bones started talking. Over the past 2 decades, researchers across Europe have begun doing something that was once forbidden. They opened the reliquaries. They extracted samples from the bones inside. They ran radiocarbon dating to determine when these people actually died. They extracted DNA to find out where they came from and whether remains in different churches matched. And they applied forensic techniques that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The results were not what the churches expected. The first problem was the dates. Radiocarbon dating works by measuring carbon the 14th of December AA in organic material. If the apostles died in the 1st century, their bones should date to roughly 1 to 70 AD. But when researchers tested relics from some of the most celebrated apostle shrines in Europe, the carbon dates came back centuries too late. Centuries too late. The people whose bones filled these reliquaries died long after the apostles. Bone fragments labeled as apostle remains returned dates from the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Not people who walked with Christ, people who lived 700 years after him. The second problem was geography. DNA analysis can identify broad ancestral origins. The apostles were Galilean Jews. Their DNA should reflect 1st century Levantine populations. But many of the tested bones carried European genetic signatures. Western European. The genetic distance between Galilee and Gaul is enormous. These bones came from the wrong side of the Mediterranean, not Galilean, not Levantine, not even Eastern Mediterranean in most cases. The bones in some of Europe's holiest reliquaries came from local medieval Europeans, farmers, merchants, monks, strangers buried in local graveyards who were repackaged as saints. And the third problem might be the most damning of all. Not just different dates, not just different origins, completely different people with no genetic relationship. Multiple churches claim to possess the same body parts from the same apostle. 2 skulls, both claim to be St. Andrew. 3 arm bones, each said to be from St. Bartholomew. When scientists compared the DNA, the samples didn't match. Different people, different centuries, different origins. The relics weren't just wrong about identity. They contradicted each other. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the medieval relic economy. In the early centuries of Christianity, relics were gifts. Bones were transported between churches as tokens of faith. But by the 4th century, demand for relics had exploded far beyond the available supply. Every new church needed a relic to consecrate its altar. Every bishop wanted something from the Holy Land. And where there's demand without supply, there's fraud. The demand for sacred remains created one of medieval Europe's most lucrative black markets. Medieval chroniclers documented the problem themselves. Guibert of Nogent wrote about relic fraud as early as 1106. He described merchants selling animal bones as sacred remains, pig bones repackaged as martyrs, dog bones sold as the fingers of apostles. It was an open secret even then. But the biggest wave of relic fraud came from a single event in 1204. The Fourth Crusade. An army of Western European knights was supposed to recapture Jerusalem. Instead, they sacked Constantinople, the richest Christian city in the world. They looted thousands of relics from Constantinople's churches and monasteries. Bones, skulls, blood vials, fragments of the true cross. Every knight and every chaplain took what they could carry. The relic trade exploded overnight. Shipping manifests from 1204 list hundreds of sacred objects bound for Western Europe. And once those relics arrived in France and Germany and Italy, they multiplied. Because if one city's apostle relic draws pilgrims and money, every city wants one. The economics were straightforward. Relics drew pilgrims. Pilgrims brought donations. Donations funded construction. Construction built cathedrals that still stand today. The Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne generated so much revenue, it financed the entire cathedral. That shrine claims to hold the bones of the Magi, 3 wise men who visited the infant Christ. But when researchers examined the provenance, the trail went cold. When records were needed, records were created, some genuine, some fabricated, most impossible to distinguish. The documented chain of custody for most apostle relics stops in the medieval period. Before the 12th century, the records become fragmented. Before the 8th century, they vanish almost entirely. There is a gap of 600 to 1,000 years between when the apostles died and when most of these relics first appear in records. And it's inside that gap where the science gets devastating. Let's look at the specific cases where science has directly tested apostle relics. Saint Andrew. Tradition says he was crucified in Patras, Greece, around 60 AD. His skull relic was held in Constantinople until the Fourth Crusade. Then it traveled to Rome. Then back to Patras in 1964 as a gift from Pope Paul VI. But here's the problem. Another church in Amalfi also claims Andrew's skull. 2 skulls, both claimed as Saint Andrew, separated by 700 miles of Mediterranean coastline. When researchers compared the available evidence, the bone characteristics didn't align with a single individual. Different estimated ages, different isotopic signatures, 2 different people bearing the same name. And Andrew is not the only apostle with this problem. St. James is an even bigger case. Millions have walked this path, one of the most famous pilgrimage routes in human history. Santiago de Compostela, the 3rd holiest site in medieval Christendom after Rome and Jerusalem. The entire Camino de Santiago pilgrimage route exists because of the belief that St. James is buried here. The claim is that his body was transported by boat from Jerusalem to the coast of Galicia after his execution in 44 AD. A body traveling from Palestine to Spain in the 1st century. That alone is extraordinary. The bones beneath Santiago Cathedral were supposedly discovered in the 9th century by a hermit following a star. That story has all the hallmarks of a medieval founding myth, designed to establish a pilgrimage site. And when archaeologists examined the tomb site underneath the cathedral, they found Roman-era remains. But Roman-era remains from Galicia would be local Iberian people, not a Jewish man from the Levant. The bones have never been subjected to modern DNA analysis or comprehensive radiocarbon dating. The Church has consistently declined requests for scientific testing of the Santiago remains, which is itself telling, when the answer might damage a billion-dollar pilgrimage industry. The scientific question becomes an economic one. Over 300,000 pilgrims complete the Camino every year. That number has tripled in 2 decades. But not every church refused testing. And that's where the evidence gets specific. In Padua, Italy, the Basilica of Santa Giustina holds what it claims are the remains of St. Luke. The testing process took months. Every fragment photographed, catalogued, and sampled under strict protocols. Luke, the physician, the gospel writer, tradition says he died in Boeotia, Greece, around 84 AD. His body was supposedly moved to Constantinople in the 4th century, then to Padua in the 12th. And unlike Santiago, the Padua Church agreed to let scientists test the remains. In 2001, a team led by geneticist Guido Barbugliani at the University of Padua conducted DNA extraction. They extracted mitochondrial DNA from the skeletal remains inside the lead coffin. The mitochondrial DNA placed the individual within a haplogroup consistent with populations from Syria and Anatolia. That actually matches. Luke was traditionally from Antioch in modern-day Turkey, and the radiocarbon dating returned results consistent with the period between the 1st and 4th centuries. Antioch was a major early Christian center. If Luke lived there, his genetic profile should reflect the local population, not medieval, not modern, a genuine ancient individual from the right part of the world. The Padua result was one of the first cases where apostle relic science produced a plausible match. But plausible is not proof. And the researchers were careful to say exactly that. The DNA confirms an ancient individual from the Eastern Mediterranean. It cannot confirm that individual was Luke. Thousands of people lived in Antioch in the 1st century. Any one of them could produce the same genetic signature. The science was consistent with the claim, but consistency is not the same as confirmation. I'm in grain quarry, where inflation progresses. And then there's the case that made international headlines. Sveti Ivan Island, off the coast of Bulgaria. In 2010, archaeologists found something unexpected. The team didn't expect to find anything significant. The island was a routine survey site. Beneath the ruins of a 5th century monastery, they uncovered a small marble reliquary. Inside was a smaller reliquary made of alabaster. And inside that, human bone fragments and a tooth. An inscription nearby attributed the relics to St. John the Baptist. The Oxford team tested them, and the results surprised everyone. Professor Tom Hyam at the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit dated the bones. The radiocarbon date came back to the 1st century AD, consistent with the time of John the Baptist. And the DNA analysis showed something equally significant. Every category checked out: date, geographic origin, biological sex, preservation quality. The individual's DNA was consistent with a Near Eastern origin, likely from the Levant. 1st century, Middle Eastern, male. Every test pointed in the same direction. The discovery made headlines worldwide. A relic that appeared to pass every scientific test thrown at it. But even the Oxford researchers stopped short of calling it proof, because the same logic applies. A first-century Middle Eastern man could be anyone from that region and period. The DNA narrows the field. It does not name the individual. This is the fundamental limitation of relic science. DNA can exclude. It can prove something is definitely not what it claims to be. The statistical reality is sobering. Thousands of men in that region would share similar genetic markers, but it cannot positively identify a single person from 2,000 years ago. Unless there is a living verified descendant to compare against, genetic identity is a probability game. And for individuals who lived 2 millennia ago with no known descendants, that probability can never reach certainty. But here's where this story gets more complicated than a simple debunking, because the science doesn't tell a clean story of fraud. It tells something messier and more human. Some relics failed spectacularly. Medieval bones from local graveyards dressed up as Holy Land saints. But some passed. The Sveti Ivan bones, the Padua remains. A handful of others where the dates and the DNA align, and some relics exist in a frustrating gray zone where science cannot give a clear answer. This is the twist that most documentaries about relics ignore. The answer isn't all fake or all real. It is a spectrum, and where any individual relic falls on that spectrum depends on evidence that often no longer exists. Consider the chain of custody problem. Even if a bone is genuinely first century and genuinely Levantine, that doesn't mean it hasn't been swapped, mixed up, or mislabeled at some point in 2,000 years. Relics were moved, divided, gifted, stolen, and recombined constantly throughout the medieval period. A bone from Jerusalem could pass through 10 different reliquaries across 5 countries in 1,000 years. At any transfer point, the wrong bone could end up in the right box. One honest mistake becomes permanent. And then there's stressio. And then there's the division problem. Medieval churches didn't just claim whole bodies. They claimed fingers, arms, teeth, skull fragments, ribs. St. Andrew alone has competing relic claims across at least 14 European churches. If you reassembled all the bones attributed to him, you'd have enough material for several people. Medieval scholars actually joked about this. They called it the multiplication of relics. Guibart of Nogent pointed out that multiple churches claim to possess the head of John the Baptist. At least 3 locations in Europe have historically claimed John the Baptist's head: Amiens, Rome, Damascus. One person cannot have 3 heads. At least 2 of those relics must be from someone else. The Oxford team tested them, and the results surprised everyone. Some misidentifications happened through genuine confusion. Labels faded, records burned, languages changed. A church burns down. The relics are recovered from the rubble, but which bone goes in which reliquary? When the provenance records are destroyed, whoever rebuilds the collection is guessing, and sometimes they guess wrong, and nobody could tell the difference. Other misidentifications were political. A bishop needed a major relic to justify his cathedral's importance, so a local saint's bones get promoted, relabeled, given a more prestigious name. Not malice, ambition. The distinction matters because it tells us something about how history works. History isn't just written by the victors. It's also written by the fundraisers. Now, let's go deeper into the specific cases that reveal the full picture. The bones beneath St. Peter's Basilica are perhaps the most studied apostle relics in existence. Excavations in the 1940s beneath the basilica revealed a complex of Roman-era tombs. In a niche within a wall covered in ancient graffiti archaeologists found bone fragments wrapped in purple cloth. Margherita Guarducci, an Italian archaeologist, became convinced the bones were Peter's. Her analysis of the graffiti on the wall found what she interpreted as coded references to Peter. The inscriptions were faint, scratched into plaster over centuries by visiting pilgrims and clergy. The bones belonged to a man in his 60s or 70s, robust build, no foot bones. That last detail caught attention. Roman crucifixion victims were sometimes nailed through the feet. The feet could have been left behind. In 968, Pope Paul VI announced the bones were St. Peter's, but the scientific community remained skeptical. The analysis had been done with 1960s technology. No DNA extraction was attempted. The radiocarbon dating was inconclusive. The identification rested largely on interpretation of the graffiti, and other scholars read the same graffiti completely differently, seeing random scratches where Guarducci saw coded messages. The Vatican has not allowed modern DNA testing on the Peter bones. That request remains unanswered. Moving beyond Peter, let's look at what happened when scientists examined the Cologne shrine. The Three Kings Shrine is the largest reliquary in Europe. Inside are bones attributed to the three magi. According to tradition, the Magi's bones were discovered in Persia, brought to Constantinople, then Milan, then Cologne in 1164. The shrine itself dates to the 1200s. But what about the bones inside? The bones have been examined several times, and the results raised more questions than answers. The remains include bones from what appear to be three different individuals, but the dating hasn't been definitive. Each bone fragment had to be individually assessed: size, condition, type, and potential for DNA extraction. Some analyses have suggested the bones could be ancient. Others have raised concerns about medieval period dating. The Church has limited full modern testing. What has been done remains partly unpublished and disputed, and this pattern repeats across Europe. Partial testing, restricted access, incomplete publication. Researchers face a fundamental access problem. The institutions that control the relics have reasons to control the science. A result confirming authenticity brings prestige and pilgrims. A result denying it threatens centuries of tradition and revenue. So many relics remain untested, not because the technology doesn't exist, but because permission is withheld. Now, one specific case shows just how tangled the relic science can get. Saint Bartholomew. Tradition holds he was martyred in Armenia, flayed alive according to the most dramatic accounts. His bones are claimed by Rome, but also by Canterbury, and by churches in Armenia, Benevento, and Frankfurt. 5 major claims for one set of remains. When examined, the competing relics cannot all be genuine. The bones in one church would need to be completely absent from the others, but several claim overlapping body parts. 2 arm bones in 2 different countries. 3 skull fragments that together would exceed the volume of one skull. When forensic anthropologists attempted to reconcile the competing claims, the anatomy simply didn't work. Too many bones for one person, the wrong shapes to fit together. At least some of these relics must be strangers. 5 fragments, 5 cities, all claiming the same man. The arithmetic alone disproves the majority. And this brings us to what might be the most revealing study of all. When researchers at multiple European universities began systematically comparing DNA from relics attributed to the same saint, they discovered the same pattern over and over. The DNA didn't match. Bones in Rome didn't match bones in Greece attributed to the same apostle. Fragments from one city were male. Fragments from another city attributed to the same person were female. Male and female bones attributed to the same man, The science was unambiguous. These were different people, and the geographic origins were just as revealing. Bones supposed to be from 1st century Galileans. The scale of the systematic comparisons left little room for doubt about the overall pattern. Carried genetic signatures typical of medieval French, German, and Italian populations. Local bones, given foreign names, placed in golden boxes, and venerated for centuries. But the most systematic studies have also confirmed something important on the other side. The failure rate isn't 100%. Some relics do produce results that align with their claims, which means the medieval church wasn't running a pure fraud. The picture is messier than that. Some genuine 1st century remains clearly did survive and travel. The early Christian communities did preserve and transport bones. Some chains of custody are solid for recent centuries, but dissolve entirely before the medieval period. The question isn't whether any real apostle bones exist. It is which specific relics are genuine and which are medieval substitutions. And for most of the 12 apostles, that question remains unanswered because the key tests haven't been done. Out of the 12, only a handful of claimed relic sets have undergone comprehensive modern analysis. Peter, untested by modern DNA methods. Andrew, contradictory results between competing sites. James, church refuses testing. John, no confirmed relic exists to test. Luke, consistent with claimed origin. For most of the 12, the bones are either untested or produce results that don't match. The strangers outnumber the saints. That is the conclusion the data points toward. So what does all of this actually mean? Not just for the relics, but for the system that created them. The easy conclusion is fraud. The accurate conclusion is more complicated. The relic system wasn't built on deception. It was built on belief infrastructure. In an era before museums and libraries, relics were how ordinary people connected to sacred history. Touching a bone that was said to be an apostle's made the divine tangible, physical, real. Whether the bone was genuine didn't change the experience. The faith was real, even when the relic wasn't. And that's a distinction the science can measure, but cannot judge. The relic system also built Europe. Literally, pilgrim hostels became hospitals. Hospitals became universities. The relic economy built institutions that outlasted the relics themselves. Cathedrals that took centuries to build. Pilgrimage routes that became trade routes. Hospitals that grew from pilgrim shelters. The bones of strangers financed some of the greatest architectural achievements in human history. Cologne Cathedral took 600 years to build. The Three Kings' bones paid for much of it. Whether those bones are genuinely from the Magi or from three unknown medieval individuals doesn't change the cathedral. The building stands regardless. The art endures. The faith community continues. The DNA evidence doesn't destroy the relic tradition. It reveals how the tradition actually worked. It was a system built on faith and maintained by economics. The bones were symbols, not specimens. Today, the pilgrims still come, but now they carry smartphones instead of prayer beads. And the people who venerate them today largely don't care what the DNA says. The relic works because of what it represents, not what it is. Science measures isotopes and haplogroups. Faith measures, meaning they answer different questions. But for historians, the scientific results are devastating in the best possible way because they reveal the actual mechanics of medieval belief, how churches competed, how economies formed around sacred objects. A growing field of scholarship now treats the relic system as an economic network. not fraud, infrastructure. How identity was constructed around physical objects, and how those objects traveled through networks of power and money. The strangers whose bones ended up in reliquaries tell us more about medieval Europe than the apostles ever could. They tell us that demand creates supply, even sacred supply. The 12 apostles remain among the most influential figures in Western civilization. Their names are carved into the foundations of churches on every continent, but the physical remains attributed to them are mostly not theirs. They belong to medieval Europeans, farmers and monks and anonymous dead, whose bones were given new names and new purpose. People who lived and died with no idea that their bones would someday be placed in golden boxes, prayed to by millions, carried in procession through city streets, all while being someone else entirely. The DNA reveals the truth. But the truth doesn't end the story, because tomorrow the pilgrims will come again. The candles will be lit, and the prayers will still be offered by people who have never heard of radiocarbon dating. The bones in the golden boxes will still be there, and the faithful will still believe, because faith was never about the bones. It was about the meaning we place inside the box, whether the bone is real or not. The apostles may be gone, but the strangers who took their place built a world, 2,000 years of veneration, and beneath it all, the quiet bones of ordinary people. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe for more episodes where we test history against the evidence. And let me know in the comments, does it matter whose bones are in the box? Or does the question itself change the meaning of what is inside? Sources in the description below.